Well, I'm going to very quickly give you kind of a bird's eye view of the research that my colleagues and I undertook starting something like 2 years ago. It took us about a year and a half to complete the report. It's a little bit beefy. I have one copy here. It's 70 pages or so. So I'm just going to give you kind of the quick takeaways, okay, from this report that we did. And again, I just want to emphasize this is work that I did with my colleague Scott Fulweiler, who actually taught at Presidio, Catherine Rushlin, who was formerly at Demos and has expertise in the area of higher ed, and Marshall Steinbaum, who is currently at the Roosevelt Institute. So this is a joint effort. Okay, so what was the question that we were asking, and what did we attempt to do in this report? So we began with the hypothesis, and there's good research already to underpin the hypothesis being that student loan debt is a drag on the economy, and therefore that eliminating the debt ought to have some sort of macroeconomic benefits. That's the hypothesis. So the question was, could the research bear that out? Would the research bear that out? What would happen if student loan debt could simply be eliminated? When we began the project, it was 1.2 trillion. When we finished the project, it was 1.5 trillion. Okay, so the beauty of compound interest and the compounding of a problem, right? So one of the questions that we thought was important to address in the report, and you'll see if you take a look at the report, which you can find on the Levy website, levy.org, is that we spend a great deal of time doing the balance sheet entries to show exactly how mechanically you would go about canceling the student loan debt. Some of you may have heard some number of years ago people talking about canceling student loan debt. There was even a Green Party candidate who was pushing this sort of thing. But when she was pressed, how do you actually go about doing it, she couldn't answer the question. So we felt it was important to actually walk people through the balance sheet mechanics of how you actually go about eliminating student loan debt from balance sheets. So a bunch of what we do in the report is answering that question. Okay, so big picture, what does the research show? So we wanted the results to be robust, so we didn't use a single model. We actually ran the simulations using two different models. Steve and Mary were friendly with Mark Zandi, who is at Moody's. The Zandi model is widely respected, and Mark was kind enough to tell them that he would allow us to work with a team there at Moody's and that we could have access to his model and we could do some runs on the Zandi model. So we used the Moody's model for some of the analysis, and we used another widely respected macro model known as the FAIR model, named after Ray Fair, an economist at Yale. So two models, right? And if the results are broadly similar, then we think that the findings are robust. We made some different assumptions using each of those two models about how the Fed might behave when the debt was being canceled. In other words, what was going to happen to interest rates over time. And I'll sort of explain why that's important. So we said there are a couple of different scenarios. One, the Fed could be very aggressive in hiking rates, and the other, the Fed could be more dovish. Okay? So all of the forecasts are done the way the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, does its budget forecast, which is a 10-year budget horizon. That's just customary. So we went with a 10-year horizon, run these two models using the different assumptions, and what we find is that on average, canceling student loan debt benefits the macro economy, and by this we mean real GDP in this case, by somewhere between $86 and $108 billion. That's real GDP. So over a 10-year horizon, it's more than $1 trillion, right? And again, it's real, not nominal. If we're in nominal, we're closer to 2-point-something trillion, so big numbers. It shaves a few percentage points off of the unemployment rate. So if the unemployment rate would have been 5.3% or 4.3%, instead you get 5% or 4%. It takes about a third of a percentage point off of unemployment. And it adds net jobs in the peak, right after the debt is canceled. You get about 1.2 to 1.5 million additional jobs annually. This is the peak job creation. So if you were to cancel student loan debt tomorrow, the bulk of the benefit happens in the first 5 years after you cancel the debt. And then the benefits diminish in the next 5 years, right? It's a 10-year horizon. Most of the benefits are up front, first 5 years, and then the benefits begin to trail off, although they're still positive. So this is what we found. Debt cancellation is tantamount to a fiscal stimulus, okay? In much the same way you mentioned the Trump tax cuts, in much the same way that tax cuts provide additional disposable income, canceling student loan debt does two things, okay? It provides a boost to disposable income. The money that is currently going to debt service is now available to do something else. So everybody who takes out their checkbook and writes a $200, $300, $500 or more check to service student loan debt no longer has to do that. What can they do with that money? So there's an income effect. There's also a wealth effect, because your wealth being the difference between what you own and what you owe. If you eliminate the debt, your liabilities are reduced. So your net worth automatically increases by the amount of outstanding student loan debt in your personal capacity. So if you believe that consumption is both a function of income and wealth, then you get a double whammy from canceling student loan debt, income effect and the wealth effect. So these models are capturing both of those things. So what you get is, I think, probably not a surprise to most people. If you didn't have that debt obligation on your balance sheet and you had more disposable income, you would do one of several things. You would spend more, save more, or pay down other debts. And so it's that additional consumption spending that provides the initial boost to economic activity, whether you go out and buy more, household durable goods, or you go out and eat more often, or get your hair cut more often, services, whatever it is, consumption spending increases. And as a result of the increase in consumption spending, businesses have more customers, demand is higher, sales are higher, revenues and profits are higher, businesses therefore have more incentive to hire and invest. So investment increases, and this is all part of a standard sort of Keynesian macro model. So the economy improves, output and employment go up. I would stress these are conservative estimates. We didn't capture every conceivable benefit to the economy that would happen as a result, and I'll come back to that. So now how do you actually cancel the debt? So we ran through a couple of scenarios. One way is, and probably the most likely, is for the cancellation to be initiated by the federal government. This is something Congress decides to do. So you're talking about two kinds of debt. You're talking about the student loan debt that already sits on the balance sheet of the federal government. That is the vast majority of the $1.5 trillion. It's on the Department of Ed's balance sheet. That's the easy part to take care of, okay? You just simply say, nobody pays it back. Okay, if you have obligations, student loan debt, and it's held by government, you don't pay it back. And that's the easy part. You can do it all at once, a one-time cancellation, or you can cancel it as the principal payments come due. And it doesn't make a macroeconomic difference which are the two ways you go about that. What the government is foregoing is the interest on the debt. Okay, so it's saying don't pay back the principal, but it's also saying you don't owe us the interest that you would have been paying to service the debt either. All right, so that's the foregone interest income, if you like, to the federal government. The rest of the debt is the privately held stuff, private label. Some of it is government guaranteed, some of it is not, okay? And so how do you deal with the stuff that's not already on the government's balance sheet? A number of possible ways. One is for the federal government to purchase the privately owned loans and cancel them outright. Another is for the government to purchase the privately owned loans and cancel them as the principal payments come due. Another option would be for the government to simply take over the payments on behalf of the borrowers. Okay, and so the government makes the payments instead of the instead of the borrower making the payments. Okay, so those are all scenarios that we run through in the paper where the government initiates the cancellation and undertakes cancellation. The other option is, I mentioned, a Green Party candidate was talking a lot about how the Fed could just make this stuff disappear. Okay, so we said, well, what if the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was the one that warehouses the losses? The Fed buys the debt and cancels it or takes over the payments. So we run through all of those scenarios. We think that the more likely of the two is that it's undertaken by the federal government as opposed to the independent Fed would probably balk. But anyway, we walk through all of the different balance sheets in the paper. So look, this is what the paper looks like. I'm not going to torture you with the balance sheet entries, which are quite complex, but it's all there. And I think it's important that someone did this work and laid it all out so that you can see exactly how the government would go about doing this. So this is how would you deal with the Department of Ed loans. Well, you cancel them directly and all at once, or you cancel them as principal comes due. How do you deal with the private label stuff? The federal government either purchases it and cancels it outright, purchases it and cancels it as payments come due, or takes over the payments. And you can see that we've walked through every single step of how each of these different scenarios would work. Now, the inevitable question: how do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? Notice that we did 1.5, depending on whose estimate you're looking at, or closer to 2 trillion in tax cuts just recently, okay? And we didn't, quote unquote, pay for them. They simply added to the deficit. And so what we did in this report was say, let the government cancel the student loan debt without any offsets. What would happen? That was the first question, okay? So we allow this to happen in the same way that the Republicans allowed the tax cuts to happen. That is, they just add to the deficit. How much do they add to the deficit? Not very much, okay? On average, the federal budget deficit rises by about 0.5%. So if the deficit was going to be 3% relative to GDP, now it's 3.5% relative to GDP. It's not a huge amount. The annual effects on the federal deficit are identical regardless of whether the Fed does the cancellation or Treasury does the cancellation. This is important because what we were doing in this, by demonstrating this, is to say that there's no free lunch. There's no way to do debt cancellation by the Fed or the Treasury and not have an impact on revenues and therefore on the federal government's budget outcome. So there is no free lunch, so to speak. State budgets, however, so the federal government's deficit relative to GDP increases, but state budgets improve, right? So if you're Wisconsin, if you're California, if you're Texas, if you're Minnesota, your budget position is going to improve. Why? Because the macroeconomy improves, because there's more job creation, the incomes are higher, wages are higher, tax revenue at the state level is higher, spending to support the unemployed is lower. So state budget positions improve. So when we looked at this, we asked the question, would debt cancellation require offsets? Would you need to either raise taxes or carve out money from some other part of the budget? And from our perspective, the answer to that question depends upon one thing, and that is the inflationary effect of the policy. And in every case in this model, the model was telling us you don't have to offset the cancellation. Why? Because you don't get an inflation problem. And so this is using both models and 2 sets of assumptions, so really 4 simulations. You see that the impact of canceling student loan debt on inflation is negligible. The maximum, the peak addition to the inflation rate is about 0.3 percentage point. So if the Fed is targeting 2%, then in 1 year you get inflation of 2.3. But it quickly peters out to next to nothing, right? So you have a small increase in inflation in the early years, and then it becomes statistically insignificant after that. So no reason to suppose that the debt cancellation would require cuts in other types of spending or a tax increase to cool the inflationary effect. It simply isn't there. All right, wrapping up. So I said there was no free lunch, and now I want to say perhaps there could be, okay? So let's be creative. If one wanted to be creative, could you create a free lunch? Could you do this? Because we know that Washington worries very much about deficits and that legislators worry very much about voting for things that might increase the size of the deficit, or at least they once did. No. At least they once did. So for those for whom supporting legislation that increases the size of the deficit is stomach churning in some sense, there might be a way to accomplish the debt cancellation without the budgetary effects. Now, I admit that this is probably unlikely, but I'm offering it as a possible way around, right? If you want to be creative, you can get creative. This is what Senator Warren was saying with respect to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico also has a debt problem. And Senator Warren's comment when she was pushing debt cancellation for Puerto Rico was, we got very creative when we were finding money to lend to the Wall Street banks after the crisis. Why can't we be equally creative in helping out Puerto Rico? And I think you can substitute student loan borrowers for Puerto Rico and ask the same question, how creative can we be? And so there are just a couple of things that I'll mention here. One is we kind of racked our brains thinking about ways that we might do this. So one way would be for the Fed to buy the student loan debt, put it on its balance sheet, tell borrowers, don't pay me anything back. The Fed then isn't receiving those payments, so the Fed's profits don't go up, and therefore the Fed doesn't return significant profits to Treasury, and therefore the Treasury's budget deficit is bigger than it would be. To prevent that from happening, you tell the Fed, go out and buy all the student loan debt, but buy a bunch of other interest-bearing assets as well, like QE, right? Buy other financial instruments that will yield interest payments to you that will more than compensate for the interest that you're not collecting on the student loan debt. In other words, the Fed still makes a profit and turns over more money to Treasury, and the deficit stays smaller as a result. If it's complicated, it's in the paper, but it's one way to do it. The other way would be essentially an accounting trick. You let the Fed buy the student loan debt, hold it on its balance sheet, and then permanently defer the losses. You just call it deferred losses. And it could be done, right? It's an accounting gimmick, I admit that. But if you're attempting to do something good for 44 million people and their loved ones and their friends and so forth, and the economy, then maybe you're willing to get a little bit creative. So there are a couple of possible ways. Both, I think, would be controversial and probably opposed by the Federal Reserve, but I offer them in the spirit of thinking creatively. All right, and then this is the last slide. Beyond the scope of the paper are the benefits that would accrue, presumably, as a result of canceling student loan debt. You would expect that there would be an increase in small business formation. Lots of research bears that out. Our models can't capture that. That there would be an increase in degree attainment. More people would end up going to school. The models don't allow us to make those calculations, so our research doesn't capture that. Increased household formation, higher credit scores, reduced vulnerability to economic shocks. As people have less debt, they're better able to cope with rocky economic times when asset prices decline or job losses occur. And so this is why I said our estimates are conservative. It's likely that the macroeconomic benefits of canceling student loan debt are even higher than those reported in our report. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay.